Chapter 17. The Arch Absurd. According to the assertion of Beelzebub, our sun neither lights nor heats. In order, my dear Hussein, that you should meanwhile have an approximate representation also of just how far that function called the instinctive sensing of reality, which is proper to every free-brain being of the whole of our great universe, is already entirely lacking in the presences of the free-centred beings breeding on the planet Earth, and especially in those of the most recent periods. It will be enough to begin with, I think, if I explain to you only about how they understand and explain to themselves the causes why there periodically proceed on their planet those cosmic phenomena which they call daylight, darkness, heat, cold, and so on. All, without exception, of the free-brain beings of that planet who have attained the age of a responsible being, and even those many and various wiseacrings existing there which they call sciences, are categorically certain that all the said phenomena arrive on their planet completely, so to say, ready-made, D-I-R-E-C-T-L-Y, from their own sun. And as Mullah Nasir Eddin would say in such cases, no more hokey-pokey about it. What is most peculiar in this case is that, except for certain beings who existed before the second Translepanian perpetuation, there absolutely no doubt whatever concerning their certainty of theirs has ever as yet crept into a single one of them. Not only has not a single one of them, having a reason which, though strange, has nevertheless some resemblance to sane logic, ever yet doubted the causes of the said phenomena, but not a single one of them has manifested concerning these cosmic phenomena even that strange special property of their common psyche, which also became proper to the free-brain beings of that planet alone, and which is called to fantasy. Having said these last words, Beelzebub, after a little while, with a bitter smile, continued to talk as follows. You, for instance, have the normal presence of a free-brain being, and within your presence there is intentionally implanted from without Oskianu, or as they say there on the earth, education, which is founded on a morality based solely on the commandments and indications of the uni-being himself and the most holy individuals near to him. And yet, if you should chance to be there among them, you should be unable to prevent the process in yourself of the being nurtrigor, that is, the process which, again there on the earth, is called irrepressible inner laughter. That is to say, you would not be able to restrain yourself from such laughter, if in some way or another they were suddenly clearly to sense and understand, without any doubt whatever, that not only does nothing like light, darkness, heat, and so on come to their planet from their sun itself, but that their supposed source of heat and light is itself almost always freezing cold, like the hairless dog of our highly esteemed Mullah Nasir Eddin. In reality, the surface of their source of heat, like that of all the ordinary suns of our great universe, is perhaps more covered with ice than the surface of what they call their North Pole. Surely this hearth of heat itself would rather borrow heat, if only a little, from some source of cosmic substance, than send a part of its own heat to any other planet, especially to that planet which, though it belongs to its system, yet in consequence of the splitting off from it of a whole side, became a lopsided monstrosity, and is now already a source of offensive shame for that poor system ours. But do you yourself know, my boy, in general how and why, in the atmosphere of certain planets, during trog-autoegocratic processes, there proceed those kitscharts, bots, klitsch, tainolair, pashachikar, and other such phenomena, which your favourites call daylight, darkness, cold, heat, and so on? Beelzebub asked Hussein. If you don't clearly understand I shall explain this also to you a little. Although I have promised to explain to you, only later, all the fundamental laws of world creation and world maintenance in detail, yet the necessity here has arisen to touch upon, if only briefly, the questions concerning these cosmic laws, without waiting for that special talk I promised. And this is necessary in order that you may be able better to take in all that we are now talking about, and also in order that what I have already told you may be transubstantiated in you in the right way. It is necessary to say, first of all, that everything in the universe, both the intentionally created and the later automatically arisen, exists and is maintained exclusively on the basis of what is called the common cosmic trog-auto-egocratic process. This most great common cosmic trog-auto-egocratic process was actualized by our endless uni-being when our most great and most holy Son Absolute had already existed, on which our all-glorious, endless Creator had and still has the chief place of his existence. This system, which maintains everything arisen and existing, was actualized by our endless Creator in order that what is called the exchange of substances, or the reciprocal feeding of everything that exists, might proceed in the universe, and thereby that the merciless hieropath might not have its maleficent effect on the Son Absolute. This same most great common cosmic trog-auto-egocratic process is actualized always and in everything on the basis of the two fundamental cosmic laws, the first of which is called the fundamental first-degree sacred heptaparapashinok, and the second, the fundamental first-degree sacred triamazikamno. Owing to these two fundamental sacred cosmic laws, there arise first from the substance called epherochrono, under certain conditions, what are called crystallizations, and from these crystallizations, but later, and also under certain conditions, there are formed various large and small, more or less independent, cosmic definite formations. It is just within and upon these cosmic definite formations that the processes of what are called the involution and evolution of the already formed concentrations and also of the said crystallizations take place. Of course, also according to the two said fundamental sacred laws, and all the results obtained from these processes in atmospheres, and further, by means of these atmospheres themselves, blend and go for the actualizing of the said exchange of matters for the purposes of the most great common cosmic trog-auto-egocrat. Epherochrono is that prime source substance with which the universe is filled, and which is the basis for the arising and maintenance of everything existing. Not only is this epherochrono the basis for the arising of all cosmic concentrations without exception, both large and small, but also all cosmic phenomena in general proceed during some transformation in this same fundamental cosmic substance, as well as during the processes of the involution and evolution of various crystallizations, or as your favourites say, of those active elements which have obtained and still continue to obtain their prime arising from this same fundamental prime source cosmic substance. Bear in mind here that it is just because of this that the mentioned objective science says that everything without exception in the universe is material. You must also know further that only one cosmic crystallization, existing under the name omnipresent Okidarnok, obtains its prime arising, although it also is crystallized from Epherochrono, from the three holy sources of the sacred Theomerta Malagos, that is, from the emanation of the most holy Son Absolute. Everywhere in the universe, this omnipresent Okidarnok, or omnipresent active element, takes part in the formation of all both great and small arisings, and is, in general, the fundamental cause of most of the cosmic phenomena, and, in particular, of the phenomena proceeding in the atmospheres. In order that you may be able to understand, at least approximately, concerning this omnipresent Okidanok, also, I must tell you, first of all, that the second fundamental cosmic law, the sacred Triamasi Kamno, consists of three independent forces. That is to say, this sacred law manifests in everything, without exception, and everywhere in the universe, in three separate independent aspects. And these three aspects exist in the universe under the following denominations. The first, under the denomination the holy affirming, the second, the holy denying, and the third, the holy reconciling. And this is also why, concerning this sacred law and its three independent forces, the said objective science has, among its formulations, specially concerning this sacred law, the following: a law which always flows into a consequence and becomes the cause of subsequent consequences, and always functions by three independent and quite opposite characteristic manifestations, latent within it, in properties neither seen nor sensed. Our sacred Theo Merta Malagos, also, that is the prime emanation of our most holy Son Absolute, acquires just this same lawfulness as its prime arising, and during its further actualizations gives results in accordance with it. And so, my boy, the omnipresent Okidanok obtains its prime arising in space outside of the most holy Son Absolute itself, from the blending of these three independent forces into one, and during its further involutions it is correspondingly changed in respect of what is called the vivifyingness of vibrations, according to its passage through what are called the stoppinders or gravity centres of the fundamental common cosmic sacred Heptapara-Pashinok. I repeat, among the number of other already definite cosmic crystallizations, the omnipresent Okidanok unfailingly always participates in both large and small cosmic formations, wherever and under whatever external surrounding conditions they may arise in the universe. This common cosmic unique crystallization, or active element, has several peculiarities proper to this element alone, and it is chiefly owing to these peculiarities proper to it that the majority of cosmic phenomena proceed, including, among other things, the said phenomena that take place in the atmosphere of certain planets. Of these peculiarities proper to the omnipresent active element alone, there are several, but it is enough, for the theme of our talk, if we become acquainted just with two of them. The first peculiarity is that when a new cosmic unit is being concentrated, then the omnipresent active element does not blend as a whole with such a new arising, nor is it transformed as a whole in any definite corresponding place, as happens with every other cosmic crystallization in all the said cosmic formations. But immediately on entering as a whole into any cosmic unit, there immediately occurs in it what is called Jarchklom, that is to say, it is dispersed into the three fundamental sources from which it obtained its prime arising, and only then do these sources, each separately, give the beginning for an independent concentration of three separate corresponding formations within the given cosmic unit. And in this way, this omnipresent active element actualizes at the outset, in every such new arising, the sources for the possible manifestation of its own sacred law of Triamasi Kamno. It must without fail be noticed also that in every cosmic formation, the said separated sources, both for the perception and for the further utilization of this property of the omnipresent active element for the purpose of the corresponding actualizing, exist and continue to have the possibility of functioning as long as the given cosmic unit exists. and only after the said cosmic unit has been completely destroyed do these holy sources of the sacred Trio-Mazikhamno, localized in the omnipresent active element Okidarnok, reblend, and they are again transformed into Okidarnok, but having now another quality of vivifyingness of vibrations. As regards the second peculiarity of the omnipresent Okidarnok, equally proper to it alone, and which it is also necessary for us to elucidate just now for the given theme of our talk, you will be able to understand about that only if you know something concerning one fundamental cosmic second-degree law existing in the universe under the denomination of the sacred Aiaiaiua. And this cosmic law is that there proceeds within every arising, large and small, when in direct touch with the emanations either of the Sun Absolute itself or of any other sun, what is called remorse. That is, a process when every part that has arisen from the results of any one holy source of the sacred Trio-Mazikhamno, as it were, revolts and criticizes the former unbecoming perceptions and the manifestations at the moment of another part of its whole, a part obtained from the results of another holy source of the same fundamental sacred cosmic law of Trio-Mazikhamno. And this sacred process, Aiaiaiua, or remorse, always proceeds with the omnipresent active element Okidarnok also. The peculiarity of this latter during this sacred process is that while the direct action either of the sacred Theomertmalogos or the emanation of any ordinary sun is round about the whole of its presence, this active element is dispersed into its three prime parts, which then exist almost independently, and when the said direct action ceases, these parts blend again and then continue to exist as a whole. Here you might as well, I think, be told, by the way, about an interesting fact I noticed, which occurred in the history of their existence, concerning the strangeness of the psyche of the ordinary free-brain beings of that planet which has taken your fancy, in respect of what they call their scientific speculations. And that is, that during the period of my many-centuried observation and study of their psyche, I had occasion to constate several times that though science appeared among them almost from the very beginning of their arising, and, it may be said, periodically, like everything else there, rose to a more or less high degree of perfection, and that, though during these and other periods, many millions of free-brained beings, called their scientists, must have arisen and been again destroyed, yet with the single exception of a certain Chinese man named Chun-Kil-Tez, about whom I shall tell you later in detail, not once has the thought entered the head of a single one of them there that between these two cosmic phenomena, which they call emanation and radiation, there is any difference whatever. Not a single one of those sorry scientists has ever thought that the difference between these two cosmic processes is just about the same as that which the highly esteemed Mullah Nasir Eddin once expressed in the following words. They are as much alike as the beard of the famous English Shakespeare and the no less famous French almanac. For the further clarification of the phenomena taking place in the atmospheres, and concerning the omnipresent active element in general, you must know and remember this also, that during the periods when, owing to the sacred process Aiaiaiua, Jarchklom proceeds in the Okidarnok, then there is temporarily released from it the proportion of the pure, that is, absolutely unblended, Ephreochrono, which unfailingly enters into all cosmic formations and there serves, as it were, for connecting all the active elements of these formations, and afterwards, when its three fundamental parts reblend, then the said proportion of Ephreochrono is re-established. Now it is necessary to touch also, of course, again only briefly, on another question, namely, what relation the omnipresent active element Okidanok has to the common presence of beings of every kind, and what are the cosmic results actualized owing to it. It is chiefly necessary to touch upon this question because you will then have still another very striking and illuminating fact for the better understanding of the difference between the various brain systems of beings, namely the systems called one-brained, two-brained and three-brained. Know first that, in general, every such cosmic formation called brain receives its formation from those crystallizations, the affirming source for whose arising, according to the sacred Trio-Mazi Kamno, is one or another of the corresponding holy forces of the fundamental sacred Trio-Mazi Kamno, localized in the omnipresent Okidanok, and the further actualizings of the same holy forces proceed by means of the presence of the beings just through those localizations. I shall sometime in the future specially explain to you about the process itself of the arising of these corresponding being brains in the presences of beings, but meanwhile let us talk, though not in detail, about the results the omnipresent Okidanok actualizes by means of these being brains. The omnipresent active element Okidanok enters into the presences of beings through all the three kinds of being food. And this proceeds because, as I have already told you, this same Okidanok obligatorily participates in the formation of all kinds of products which serve as all three being foods, and is always contained in the presence of these products. And so, my boy, the chief peculiarity of the omnipresent Okidanok in the given case is that the process of Jarchklom proceeds in it within the presence of every being also, but not from being in contact with the emanations of any large cosmic concentration, but the factors for this process in the presences of beings are either the results of the conscious processes of part dog duty on the part of the beings themselves, about which processes I shall also explain to you in detail later, or of that process of great nature herself which exists in the universe under the name Kakornonoyan actualization, which process means the obtaining of the required totality of vibrations by adaptation. This latter process proceeds in beings absolutely without the participation of their consciousness. In both cases, when Okidanok enters into the presence of a being, and the process of Jarchklom proceeds in it, then each of its fundamental parts blends with those perceptions which correspond with it according to what is called kindred vibrations, and which are present in the being at the moment, and further, these parts are concentrated upon the corresponding localization, that is, upon the corresponding brain, and these blendings are called being impulsacri. It is necessary to notice further that these localizations, or brains in beings, serve not only as apparatuses for the transformation of corresponding cosmic substances for the purposes of the most great common cosmic trog-auto-egocrat, but also as the means for beings whereby their conscious self-perfecting is possible. This latter aim depends upon the quality of the presence of the being impulsacri concentrated, or as is otherwise said, deposited upon the said corresponding being brains. Concerning the qualities of being impulsacri, there is among the direct commandments of our all-embracing endlessness even a special commandment which is very strictly carried out by all free-brain beings of our great universe, and which is expressed in the following words: always guard against such perceptions as may soil the purity of your brains. Free-brain beings have the possibility personally to perfect themselves, because in them there are localized free centers of their common presence or free brains, upon which afterwards, when the process of Jarchklom proceeds in the omnipresent Okidanok, the free holy forces of the sacred Trio-Mazi Kamno are deposited and acquire the possibility for their further this time independent actualizings. Just in this is the point that the beings having this free brain system can, by the conscious and intentional fulfilling of being part dog duty, utilize from this process of Jachkram in the omnipresent Okidarnok its free holy forces for their own presences, and bring their presences to what is called the Sekronol Arnzenikanian state. That is to say, they can become such individuals as have their own sacred law of Triomasi Kamno, and thereby the possibility of consciously taking in and coating in their common presence all that holy which, incidentally, also aids the actualizing of the functioning in these cosmic units of objective or divine reason. But the great terror of it, my boy, lies just in this, that although in those free-brain beings who have interested you and who breed on the planet Earth, there arise and are present in them, up to the time of their complete destruction, these free independent localizations or free being brains, through which separately all the free holy forces of the sacred Triomasi Kamno, which they might also utilize for their own self-perfecting, are transformed and go for further corresponding actualizations, yet chiefly on account of the irregular conditions of ordinary being existence established by them themselves. These possibilities beat their wings in vain. It is interesting to note that the said being brains are found in the same parts of the planetary body of these free brain beings who arise on the planet Earth as in us, namely, 1. The brain, predetermined by great nature for the concentration and further actualizing of the first holy force of the sacred Triomasi Kamno, called the Holy Affirming, is localized and found in the head. 2. The second brain, which transforms and crystallizes the second holy force of the sacred Triomasi Kamno, namely the Holy Denying, is placed in their common presences, also as in us, along the whole of their back in what is called the spinal column. 3. But as regards the place of concentration and source for the further manifestation of the third holy force of the sacred Triomasi Kamno, namely the Holy Reconciling, the exterior form of this being brain in the free brain being there bears no resemblance whatever to ours. It must be remarked that in the primordial free brain beings there, this said being brain was localized in the same part of their planetary body as in us, and had an exterior form exactly similar to our own. But for many reasons which you will be able to understand for yourself during the course of my further talks, great nature was compelled, little by little, to regenerate this brain and to give it the form which it now has in the contemporary beings. This being brain in the contemporary free brain beings there is not localized in one common mass, as is proper to the presences of all the other free brain beings of our great universe, but is localized in parts according to what is called specific functioning, and each such part is localized in a different place of their whole planetary body. But although, in its exterior form, this being centre of theirs has now variously placed concentrations, nevertheless, all its separate functionings are correspondingly connected with each other, so that the sum total of these scattered parts can function exactly as in general it is proper for it to function. They themselves call these separate localizations in their common presence nerve nodes. It is interesting to notice that most of the separate parts of this being brain are localized in them, just in that place of their planetary body where such a normal being brain should be, namely in the region of their breast, and the totality of these nerve nodes in their breast they call the solar plexus. And so, my boy, the process of Jachkram in the omnipresent Okidarnok proceeds in the presence of each of these favourites of yours, and in them also all its free holy forces are blended independently with other cosmic crystallizations, and go for the corresponding actualizations. But as, chiefly owing to the already mentioned abnormal conditions of being existence, gradually established by them themselves, they have entirely ceased to fulfil being part dog duty. Then, in consequence of this, none of these holy sources of everything existing, with the exception of the denying source alone, is transubstantiated for their own presences. The crystallizations arising in their presences from the first and from the third holy forces go almost entirely for the service only of the common cosmic trog-auto-egocratic process, while for the coating of their own presences there are only the crystallizations of the second part of the omnipresent Okidarnok, namely of the holy denying. And hence it is that the majority of them remain with presences consisting of the planetary body alone, and thus are for themselves destroyed forever. As regards all the peculiarities proper to the omnipresent, everywhere penetrating active element Okidarnok alone, and also as regards the further results which these peculiarities actualize, you will have a complete representation of them only after I shall have explained to you, in more or less detail, as I have already promised, about the fundamental laws of world creation and world maintenance. But meanwhile, I shall tell you about those elucidating experiments concerning this omnipresent cosmic crystallization, at which I was personally present. But I must tell you that I was an eyewitness of these said elucidating experiments, not on that planet Earth which has taken your fancy, nor did your favourites make them, but on the planet Saturn, where they were made by that free-brain being who during almost the whole period of my exile in that solar system was my real friend, about whom I recently promised to tell you a little more in detail. Chapter 18. The Arch Preposterous. Beelzebub continued as follows. The cause of my first meeting with that free-centred being, who subsequently became my essence friend, and by whom I saw the said experiments with the omnipresent Okidarnok, was as follows. That you may better represent to yourself the events of this tale of mine, you must first of all know that at the beginning of my exile to that solar system, certain corresponding essence friends of mine, who had not taken part in those events from which the causes of my exile had issued, performed, concerning my personality, that sacred process which exists in the universe under the name of the sacred Vusnush-Litzval. That is to say, concerning my personality, there was implanted in the presences of those free-brain beings, by means of another sacred process called Askalunuzaza, that which objective science divines by the notion, trust another like yourself. Well then, just after my arrival in that solar system Ors, when I began visiting its various planets and first descended upon the surface of the planet Saturn, it turned out in connection with the aforesaid that one of the beings who had undergone the sacred action of Vusnush-Litzval regarding my person was what is called there the Hara-Hara-Hurara of all the free-centred beings arising and existing on the planet Saturn. On the planet Saturn, a being is called the Hara-Hara-Hurara, who is the sole chief over all the other beings on that planet. Similar being chiefs exist also on all the other planets upon which free-brain beings breed. They are differently named on different planets, and on your planet Earth, such a chief is called a king. The only difference is that while everywhere else, even on all the other planets of the same system, there is one such king for the whole of the given planet, on your peculiar planet Earth, there is a separate king for every accidentally segregated group of these favourites of yours, and sometimes even several. Well then, when I first descended on the surface of the planet Saturn and mingled with the free-centred beings there, it chanced that I had occasion the next day to meet the Hara-Hara-Hurari himself of the planet Saturn, and during what is called our exchange of subjective opinions, he invited me to make his own Ha-Huri, that is, his own palace. the chief place of my existence during the whole of my sojourn on their planet. And this I did. So, my boy, when we were once talking simply according to the flow of what is called being associative mentation, and happened to touch on the question, among other things, of the strange results actualized in the manifestations of the particularities of the omnipresent Okidanok, the venerable Horari of the planet Saturn first mentioned that one of his learned being subjects, by name Harhak, had recently devised for the elucidation of many of the previously unexplained properties of that cosmic substance an exceedingly interesting appliance which he called a Raharaha, the chief demonstrating part of which he called a Haraharatsa. And further, he offered to make, if I wished, the necessary arrangements for showing me all these new inventions and for giving me every possible explanation of them. The result of it all was that the following day, escorted by one of that venerable Horari's court, I went to the place of that existence, of that Gornahor Harhak, where I first saw those novel elucidatory experiments with the omnipresent Okidanok. Gornahor Harhak, who afterwards, as I've already told you, became my essence friend, was then considered one of the foremost scientists among the ordinary free-brain beings of the whole universe, and all his constatations, as well as the elucidatory apparatuses he had invented, were everywhere widespread, and other learned beings on the various planets were using them more and more. Here it will do no harm to remark that I also, thanks only to his learning, had later in my observatory on the planet Mars that Tescuanu which, when it was finally established, enabled my sight to perceive, or as is said, approach the visibility of remote cosmic concentrations, 7,285 times. Strictly speaking, it was owing to just this Tescuanu that my observatory was afterwards considered one of the best constructions of its kind in the whole universe, and, most important of all, it was by means of this Tescuanu that I myself thereafter could, even while staying at home on the planet Mars, relatively easily see and observe the processes of the existence occurring on the surfaces of those parts of the other planets of that solar system which, in accordance with what is called the common cosmic harmonious movement, could be perceived by being sight at the given moment. When Gornahor Harhak was informed who we were and why we had come, he approached us and forthwith very amiably began his explanations. Before beginning his explanations, I think it not inadvisable to warn you once and for all that all my conversations with various free-centred beings arising and existing on various planets of that system where I was obliged to exist for the sins of my youth, as for instance in the present case, the conversations with this Gornahor Harhak, which I am now about to relate to you while we travel on the spaceship Karnak, all proceeded in dialects still quite unknown to you, and sometimes even, by the way, in such dialects the consonancies of which were quite indigestible for the perception by normal being functions assigned for this purpose. And so, my boy, in view of all this, I shall not repeat these conversations word for word, but shall give you only their sense in our speech, continuing, of course, to employ those terms and specific names, or rather those consonancies produced by what are called being vocal chords, which consonancies are used by your favourites of the planet Earth, and which have now become for you, owing to continued repetition during my tales about them, habitual and easily perceived. Yes, it must be noticed here that the word Gornahor is used by the free-brain beings on the planet Saturn in courtesy. They utter it before the name of one whom they are addressing. It is the same with your favourites on the planet Earth. They also have added to the name of every person the word Mr., or sometimes a whole meaningless phrase expressing the notion for which our Honourable Mullah Nasir ad-Din has the following sentence. And namely, he says, "Nevertheless, there's more reality in it than in the wiseacrings of an expert in monkey business." Well then, my boy, when this subsequent essent friend of mine, Gornahor Harhark, was informed of what was required of him, he invited us by a sign to approach one of the special appliances which he had made, and which, as it later turned out, was named by him Har-har-har-hartsa. When we were nearer the said special and very strange construction, he pointed to it with a particular feather of his right wing and said, "This special appliance is the principal part of the whole of my new invention, and it is just in this that the results are revealed and shown of almost all the peculiarities of the omnipresent world substance Okidarnok." And, pointing to all the other special appliances also present in the Kurur, he added, "I succeeded in obtaining extremely important elucidations concerning the omnipresent and everywhere penetrating Okidarnok, because thanks to all these separate special appliances of my invention, it became possible first to obtain all three fundamental parts of the omnipresent Okidarnok from every kind of and intraplanetary process, and then artificially to blend them into a whole, and secondly, also artificially to dissociate them and elucidate the specific properties of each part separately in its manifestations." Having said this, he again pointed to the Har-har-hartsa, and added that by means of the elucidating apparatus, not only can an ordinary being clearly understand the details of the properties of the three absolutely independent parts, which in their manifestations have nothing in common, of the whole unique active element, the particularities of which are the chief cause of everything existing in the universe, but also any ordinary being can become categorically convinced that no results of any kind normally obtain from the processes occurring through this omnipresent world substance can ever be perceived by beings or sensed by them. Certain being functions, however, can perceive only those results of the said processes which proceed for some reason or other abnormally, on account of causes coming from without and issuing either from conscious sources or from accidental mechanical results. The part of Gornahor Harhark's new invention, which he himself called the Har-har-har-hartsa and regarded as the most important, was in appearance very much like the Terzik Kiano, or as your favourites would say, a huge electric lamp. The interior of this special structure was rather like a smallish room with a door that could be hermetically closed. The walls of this original construction were made of a certain transparent material, the appearance of which reminded me of that which on your planet is called glass. As I learned later, the chief particularity of this said transparent material was that, although by means of the organ of sight beings could perceive through it the visibility of every kind of cosmic concentration, yet no rays of any kind, whatever the causes they may have arisen from, could pass through it, either from within out or from without in. As I looked at this part of this said astonishing being invention, I could through its transparent walls clearly distinguish inside in the centre what seemed to be a table and two chairs, hanging above the table what is called an electric lamp, and underneath it three things exactly alike, each resembling the Momonon Ordor. On the table and by the side of it stood or lay several different apparatuses and instruments unknown to me. Later it became clear that the said objects contained in this Har-har-har-hartsa, as well as everything we had later to put on, were made of special materials invented by this Gornahor Harhark. And as regards these materials also, I shall explain a little more in detail at the proper time in the course of my further explanations concerning Gornahor Harhark. Meanwhile, Bear in mind that in the enormous career or workshop of Gornahor Harhak, there were, besides the already mentioned Sahaha, several other large independent appliances, and among them two quite special what are called life chakans, which Gornahor himself called Kriarihiri Rihi. It is interesting to note that your favourites also have something like this life chakon, or Kriarihiri Rihi, and they name such an apparatus a dynamo. There was also there, apart, another independent large appliance, which, as it afterwards appeared, was a solu honora horna of special construction, or as your favourites would say, a pump of complex construction for exhausting atmosphere to the point of absolute vacuum. While I was looking over all this with surprise, Gornahor Harhak himself approached the said pump of the special construction, and with his left wing moved one of its parts, owing to which a certain mechanism began to work in the pump. He then approached us again and, pointing with the special feather of his right finger to the largest life chakun, or Kriarihiri Harahi, or dynamo, further continued his explanations. He said, by means of this special appliance, there are first sucked in, separately from the atmosphere, or from any intra or supplanetary formation, all the three independent parts of the omnipresent active element Okidarnok present in it, and only afterwards, when in a certain way these separate independent parts are artificially reblended in the Kriarihiri Rihi into a single whole, does the Okidarnok, now in its usual state, flow, and is it concentrated there, in that container, saying, which he again, with the same special feather, pointed to something very much like what is called a generator. And then from there, he said, Okidarnok flows here into another Kriarihiri, or dynamo, where it undergoes the process of Jarchklum, and each of its separate parts is concentrated there in those other containers. And this time he pointed to what resembled accumulators. And only then do I take from the secondary containers, by means of various artificial appliances, each active part of Okidarnok separately for my elucidatory experiments. I shall first demonstrate to you, he continued, one of the results which occur when, for some reason or other, one of the active parts of the omnipresent Okidarnok is absent during the process of their striving to reblend into a whole. At the present moment, this special construction contains a space which is indeed an absolute vacuum, obtained, it must be said, only owing firstly to the special construction of the suction pump and to the materials of special quality of which the instruments are made, which alone make experiments possible in an absolute vacuum, and secondly, to the properties and the strength of the material of which the walls of this part of my new invention are made. Having said this, he pulled another lever, and again continued. Owing to the pulling of this lever, that process has begun in this vacuum, whereby in the separate parts of the omnipresent Okidarnok there proceeds what is called the striving to reblend into a whole. But since, intentionally by an able reason, in the present case myself, the participation of that third part of Okidarnok existing under the name of Parijara Hat Nat Tios is artificially excluded from the said process, then this process proceeds there just now between only two of its parts, namely, between those two independent parts which science names Anodonatius and Caphordinatius, and in consequence, instead of the obligatory law-conformable results of the said process, that non-lawful conformable result is now actualized, which exists under the denomination of the result of the process of the reciprocal destruction of two opposite forces, or as ordinary beings express it, the cause of artificial light. The striving to reblend into a whole of two active parts of the omnipresent Okidarnok, which is proceeding at the present moment there in this vacuum, has a force, as calculated by objective science, of 3,040,000 what are called volts, and this force is indicated by the needle of that special appliance there. Pointing to a something very much like the apparatus existing also on your planet and called their voltmeter, he said, "One of the advantages of this new invention of mine for the demonstration of the given phenomenon is that in spite of the usual power of the process of the force of striving now proceeding there, the what are called Zaunictisian momentum vibrations, which most beings consider also to be rays, and which ought to be obtained and to issue from this process, do not issue out of the place of their arising, that is, out of this construction in which the particularities of the omnipresent Okidarnok are being elucidated. And in order that the beings who are outside of this part of my invention may nevertheless also have the possibility of elucidating the force of the given process, I intentionally made the composition of the material of the wall in one place such that it has the property of permitting the passage through it of the said Zaunictisian momentum, vibration, or rays." Having said this, he approached nearer to the Hara Hara Hartza and pressed a certain button. The result was that the whole of the enormous kriya, or workshop, was suddenly so strongly lit up that our organs of sight temporarily ceased to function, and only after a considerable time had passed could we, with great difficulty, raise our eyelids and look around. When we had recovered, and Gornahor Hahak had pulled still another lever, which resulted in the whole surrounding space being restored to its former usual appearance, he first, with his customary angel voice, again drew our attention to the voltmeter, the needle of which constantly indicated the same figure, and then continued. "You see that, although the process of the clash of two opposite component parts of the omnipresent Okidarnok, of the same power of force of striving, still continues, and that the part of the surface of this construction which has the property of admitting the passage of the said rays is still open, yet in spite of all this there is no longer the phenomenon which ordinary beings define by the phrase the causes of artificial light. And this phenomenon is no longer there, only because by my last pulling of a certain lever, I introduced into the process of the clash of two component parts of Okidarnok a current of the third independent component part of Okidarnok, which began to blend proportionally with its other two parts, owing to which the result derived from this kind of blending of the three component parts of the omnipresent Okidarnok, unlike the process of the non-law conformable blending of its two parts, cannot be perceived by beings with any of their being functions." After all these explanations of his, Gornahor Hahak then proposed that I should venture to enter with him that demonstrating part itself of his new invention, in order that I might become, there within, an eyewitness of many particular manifestations of the omnipresent and everything penetrating active element. Of course, without thinking long about it, I immediately decided and gave my consent. And I immediately decided, chiefly because I expected to obtain in my being unchangeable and imperishable objective essence satisfaction. When this future essence friend of mine had my consent, he at once gave the necessary orders to one of his assistants. It appeared that for the actualization of what he proposed, various preparations had first to be made. First of all, his assistants put on Gornahor Hahak and myself some special, very heavy suits, resembling those which your favourites call diving suits, but with many small heads of what are called bolts projecting, and when these extremely peculiar suits had been put on us, his assistants screwed up the heads of these bolts in a certain order. On the inner side of these diving suits, at the ends of the bolts, there were, it appeared, special plates which pressed against parts of our planetary body in a certain way. It later also became quite clear to me that this was necessary in order that there might not occur to our planetary bodies what is called Tara Nor Anura, or as it might otherwise be said, in order that our planetary bodies should not fall to pieces, as usually occurs to sur- and intraplanetary formations of every kind when they happen to come into an entirely atmosphereless space. In addition to these special suits, they placed on our heads a something resembling what is called a diver's helmet, but with very complicated what are called connectors projecting from them. One of these connectors, which was called the Ha-Harin Hara, meaning sustainer of the pulsation, was something long like a rubber tube. One end of it, by means of complicated appliances on the helmet itself, was hermetically attached to the corresponding place of the helmet for the breathing organs, while the other end, after we had already entered that strange Ha-Hara-Haratsa, was screwed to an apparatus there, which was connected in its turn with the space, the presence of which corresponded to the second being food. Between Gornahor Harhak and myself there was also a special connector, through which we could easily communicate with each other while we were inside the Hara-Hara-Ha-Hartsaha, from which the atmosphere was pumped out to make a vacuum. One end of this connector also, by means of appliances that were on the helmets, was fitted in a certain way to what are called my organs of hearing and speech, and the other end was fitted to the same organs of Gornahor Harhak. Thus, by means of this connector between my subsequent essence friend and myself, there was set up, as again your favourites would say, a peculiar telephone. Without this appliance we could not have communicated with each other in any way, chiefly because Gornahor Harhak was, at that time, still a being with a presence perfected only up to the state called the sacred Inquazanu, and a being with such a presence not only cannot manifest himself in an absolutely empty space, but he cannot even exist in it, even though the products of all the free being foods be artificially introduced into him in such a space. But the most curious, and, as it is said, the most cunningly ingenious of all the connectors there for various purpose on these strange diving suits and helmets, was the connector created by that great scientist Gornahor Harhak to enable the organ of sight of ordinary beings to perceive the visibility of all kinds of surrounding objects in an absolutely empty space. One end of this astonishing connector was fitted in a certain way also by means of appliances on the helmets to our temples, while the other end was joined to what is called the Amskumutator, which in its turn was joined in a certain way by means of what are called wires to all the objects within the Ha-Ha-Ha-Hartsaha, as well as to those outside, namely to those objects whose visibility was needed during the experiments. It is very interesting to notice here that to each end of that appliance, a creation almost incredible for ordinary free-centered being reason, two independent connectors, also of wire, were led, and through them what are called special magnetic currents flowed from outside. As it was afterwards explained to me in detail, these connectors and the said special magnetic currents had, it seems, been created by that truly great scientist Gornahor Harhak, in order that the presences of learned free-centered beings, even those not perfected to the sacred Ink-Uzanu, might, owing to one property of the magnetic current, be reflected for their own essences, and that, owing to another property of this current, the presence of the mentioned objects might also be reflected, so that thereby the perception of the reality of the said objects might be actualized by their imperfect organs of being sight in a vacuum containing none of these factors or those results of various cosmic concentrations which have received such vibrations, from the actualization of which alone the functioning of any being organ whatsoever is possible. Having fitted upon us the said very heavy appliances for enabling beings to exist in a sphere not corresponding for them, the assistance of this then still great all-universal scientist Gornahor, with the help again of special appliances, carried us into the Hara itself, and having screwed up all the free ends of the connectors projecting from us to the corresponding apparatuses in the Hara itself, went out and hermetically closed behind them the only way by which it was still possible, if at all, to have any communication with what is called the everything representing one world. When we were alone in the Hara itself, Gornahor, after turning one of what are called switches there, said, "The work of the pump has already begun, and soon it will have pumped out all the results here without exception of those cosmic processes, whatever they may be, the totality of the results of which is the basis and significance, as well as the process itself, of the maintenance of the existence of everything existing in the whole of this, everything representing one world." And he added in a half-sarcastic tone, "Soon we shall be absolutely isolated from everything existing and functioning in the whole of the universe. But, on the other hand, owing firstly to my new invention, and secondly to the knowledge we have already attained for ourselves, we have not only now the possibility of returning to the said world, to become again a particle of all that exists, but also we shall soon be worthy to become non-participating eyewitnesses of certain of these world laws, which for ordinary uninitiated free-centered beings are what they call great inscrutable mysteries of nature, but which in reality are only natural and very simple results automatically flowing one from the other." While he was speaking, one could feel that this pump, another also very important part of the whole of his new invention, was perfectly actualizing the work assigned to it by this being with reason. To enable you to represent to yourself and understand better the perfection of this part also of the whole of this new invention of Gornahor, I must not fail to tell you also about the following. Although I personally, as a free-brain being also, had had occasion many times before, owing to certain quite particular reasons, to be in atmosphereless spaces, and had had to exist, sometimes for a long time, by means of the sacred cream bowl azulmara alone, and although from frequent repetition a habit had been acquired in my presence of moving from one sphere to another gradually and almost without feeling any inconvenience from the change in the presence of the second being food occurring with the change of the presences of cosmic substances undergoing transformation, and which are always around both large and small cosmic concentrations, and also, although the causes themselves of my arising and the subsequent process of my being existent were arranged in an entirely special way, in consequence of which the various being functions contained within my common presence had, perforce, gradually become also special, yet, nevertheless, in spite of it all, the pumping out of the atmosphere by the said pump then proceeded with such force that such sensations were impressed on the separate parts of the whole of my presence that even today I can very clearly experience the process of the flow of my state at that time and relate it to you almost in detail. This extremely strange state began in me shortly after Gornahor had spoken in a half-sarcastic tone about our imminent situation. In all my free being centres, namely in the free centres localized in the presence of every free-centred being, and which exist under the names of thinking, feeling and moving centres, there began to be perceived, separately and independently in each of them in a very strange and unusual way, very definite impressions that there was taking place in the separate parts of my whole planetary body an independent process of the sacred Rus Ku'anu, and that the cosmic crystallizations which compose the presences of these parts were flowing in vain. At first, what is called my initiative of constatation proceeded in the usual way, that is, according to what is called the centre of gravity of associative experiencing. But later, when this initiative of constatation of everything proceeding in me gradually and almost imperceptibly became the function of my essence alone, the latter not only became the unique all-embracing initiator of the constating of everything proceeding in me, but also everything, without exception, of that which newly proceeded began to be perceived by and fixed in this essence of mine. From the moment that my essence began to perceive impressions directly and to constate independently that, from what was proceeding, there was being entirely destroyed, as it were, in my common presence, firstly the parts of my planetary body, and then, little by little, also the localizations of the second and third being centres. At the same time, a constatation was definitely made that the function of these latter centres passed gradually to my thinking centre and became proper to it, with the consequence that the thinking centre, with the increasing intensity of its functioning, became the unique, powerful perceiver of everything actualized outside of itself, and the autonomous initiator of the constating of everything proceeding in the whole of my presence as well as outside of it. While this strange, and to my reason then, still incomprehensible being experiencing was proceeding in me, Gornahor himself was occupied in pulling some levers and switches, of which there were very many at the edges of the table where we were placed. An incident which happened to Gornahor himself changed all this being experiencing of mine, and in my common presence the usual inner being experiencing was resumed. The following is what happened. Gornahor, with all those unusual heavy appliances which had been put on him as well, suddenly found himself at a certain height above the chair and began to flounder, as our dear Mullah Nasir Eddin says, like a puppy who has fallen into a deep pond. As it afterwards proved, my friend Gornahor had made a mistake while pulling the mentioned levers and switches, and had made certain parts of his planetary body more tense than was necessary. In consequence, his presence, together with everything on him, had received a shock, and also the momentum given by the shock, and owing to the tempo proceeding in his presence, from taking in the second being food, and to the absence of any resistance in that absolutely empty space, he began to drift, or as I have already said, to flounder like a puppy who has fallen into a deep pond. Having said this with a smile, Beelzebub became silent. A little later he made a very strange gesture with his left hand, and with an intonation not proper to his own voice, he continued, "While I am gradually recalling and telling you about all this concerning the events of a period of my existence now long since past, the wish arises in me to make a sincere confession to you, just to you, one of my direct heirs, who must inevitably represent the sum of all my deeds during the periods of the process of my past being existence. And namely, I wish sincerely to confess to you that when my essence, with the participation of the parts of my presence, subject to it alone, had independently decided to take a personal part in those scientific elucidatory experiments with the demonstrating part of the new invention of Gornahor, and I had entered into this demonstrating part without the least compulsion from outside. Yet in spite of it all, my essence allowed to creep into my being and to be developed, side by side with the said strange experiencings, a criminally egoistic anxiety for the safety of my personal existence. However, my boy, in order that you may not at this moment be too distressed, it is not superfluous to add that this happened in me then for the first and also for the last time during all the periods of my being existence. But perhaps it would be better for the present not to touch on questions that concern exclusively only our family. Let us rather return to the tale I've begun about the omnipresent Okidarnok and my essence friend Gornahor Harhark, who was, by the way, at one time considered everywhere among ordinary free-brain beings as a great scientist, and is now, though he still continues to exist, not only considered not great, but thanks to his own result, that is to say, to his own son, is what our dear Mullah Nasir ad-Din would call a has-been, or, as he sometimes says in such cases, he is already sitting in an old American galosh. Well, then, while floundering, Gornahor Harhark, with great difficulty, and only by means of a special and very complicated manoeuvre which he made, finally managed to get his planetary body, burdened with the various unusually heavy appliances, down onto the chair again, and this time he fixed it all with the aid of special screws which were on the chair for that purpose. And when we were both more or less arranged and communication was possible between us by means of the said artificial connectors, he first drew my attention to those apparatuses hanging over the table, which I told you were very much like the momonodors. On close inspection, all these were alike in appearance, and served as three identical sockets, from the ends of each of which carbon candles projected, such as are usually to be found in the apparatuses which your favourites call electric arc lamps. Having drawn my attention to these three socket-like momonodors, he said, "Each of these externally similar apparatuses has a direct connection with those secondary containers, which I pointed out to you while we were still outside, and in which, after the artificial Jarchklum, each of the active parts of Okidarnok collects into a general mass. I have adapted these three independent apparatuses in such a way that there, in this absolutely empty space, we can obtain from those secondary containers for the required experiment as much as we wish of every active part of Okidarnok in a pure state, and also we can at will change the force of the striving to reblend into a whole, which is acquired in them and which is proper to them according to the degree of density of the concentration of the mass. And here, within this absolutely empty space, I shall first of all show you that same non-law conformable phenomenon which we recently observed while we were outside the place where it proceeded. And namely, I shall again demonstrate to you this world phenomenon which occurs when, after a law conformable Jarchklom, the separate parts of the whole Okidarnok meet in a space outside of a law conformable arising and, without the participation of one part, strive to reblend into a whole. Having said this, he first closed that part of the surface of the Ha-Ha-Ha-Ha-Ha-Sahar, the composition of which had the property of allowing rays to pass through it. Then he pulled two switches and pressed a certain button, as a result of which the small plate lying on that table, composed of a certain special mastic, automatically moved towards the mentioned carbon candles, and then, having again drawn my attention to the ammeter and the voltmeter, he added, "I have again admitted the influx of parts of the Okidarnok, namely the anode donatus and the cathode donatus, of equal force of striving to reblend." When I looked at the ammeter and the voltmeter, and indeed saw that their needles moved and stopped on the same figures I had noticed the first time we were still outside the Ha-Ha-Ha-Ha-Ha-Sahar, I was greatly surprised, because in spite of the indications of the needles and the intimation of Gornahor Harhark himself, I had neither noticed nor sensed any change in the degree of my perception of the visibility of the surrounding objects. So, without waiting for his further explanations, I asked him, "But why then is there no result from this non-law conformable striving to reblend into a whole of the parts of the Okidarnok?" Before replying to this question, he turned off the only lamp which worked from a special magnetic current. My astonishment increased still more, because in spite of the darkness which instantly ensued, it could clearly be seen through the walls of the ha-ha-ha-ha-ha-ha that the needles of the ammeter and voltmeter still stood in their former places. Only after I had somehow got accustomed to such a surprising constatation, Gornahar said, "I have already told you that the composition of the material of which the walls of this construction, in which we are at this moment, are made, possess the property of not allowing any vibrations arising from any source whatsoever to pass through it, with the exception of certain vibrations arising from nearby concentrations, and those latter vibrations can be perceived by the organs of sight of free brain beings, and even then, of course, only of normal beings. Furthermore, according to the law called heterotogetar, the sonic Isinunanian momentum vibrations, or rays, acquire the property of acting on the organs of perception of beings only after they have passed a limit defined by science in the following formula. The result of the manifestation is proportionate to the force of striving received from the shock. And so, as the given process of the clash of the two parts of the okidarnok has the strength of great power, the result of the clash is manifested much further than the place of its arising. Now look." Having said this, he pressed some other button, and suddenly the whole interior of the Hara-Hara-Hatsahar was filled with the same blinding light which, as I have already told you, I experienced when I was outside the Hara-Hara-Hatsahar. It appeared that the said light was obtained because by pressing this button, Gornahor had again opened that part of the wall of the Hara-Hara-Hatsahar which had the property of permitting rays to pass through it. As he explained further, the light was only a consequence of the result of the striving to reblend into a whole of the parts of Okidarnok proceeding in that absolutely empty space within the Hara-Hatsahar, and manifested owing to what is called reflection from outside back to the place of its arising. After this he continued as follows: "I shall now demonstrate to you how and by what combinations of the process of Jartsklom and of the striving to reblend into a whole of the active parts of Okidarnok there arise in planets from what are called the minerals which compose their interior presence, definite formations of varying densities, as for instance mineraloids, gases, metalloids, metals, and so on. How these latter are afterwards transformed owing to these same factors, one into another, and how the vibrations flowing from these transformations constitute just that totality of vibrations which gives the planets themselves the possibility of stability in the process called the common system harmonious movement. For my proposed demonstrating, I must obtain, as I always do, the necessary materials from outside, which my pupils will give me by means of appliances which I have prearranged. It is interesting to remark that while he was speaking, he was at the same time tapping with his left foot on a certain something, very much like what your favourites call the famous Morse transmission apparatus, famous, be it said, of course, only on the planet Earth. And a little later there slowly ascended from the lower part of the Hara-Hara-Hatsahar a small something like a box, also with transparent walls, within which, as it proved later, were certain minerals, metalloids, metals, and various gases in liquid and solid states. Then, with the aid of various appliances which were at one side of the table, he first of all, with complicated manipulation, took out from the box some what is called red copper and placed it on the mentioned plate, and then said, "This metal is a definite planetary crystallization and is one of the densities required for the said stability in the process called the common system harmonious movement. It is a formation from preceding processes of the action of the parts of the omnipresent Okidarnok, and at the present moment I wish to allow the subsequent transformation of this metal to proceed artificially and acceleratorily by means of the peculiarities of the same factors. I wish to aid artificially the evolution and involution of its elements towards a greater density, or, on the contrary, towards their transformation back to a primal state. To make the picture of the further elucidatory experiments clearer to you, I find I must first inform you, even if only briefly, of my first personal scientific deductions concerning the evidence of the causes and conditions owing to which there proceeds in the planets themselves the crystallizing of separate parts of the Okeadarnok in these or the other said definite formations. Evidently, first of all from any non-law conformable Jarchklom of the omnipresent Okeadarnok, which is in the presence of every planet, its separate parts are localized in the medium of that part of the presence of the planet, that is to say, in that mineral which was at the given moment in the place where the said non-law conformable Jarchklom occurred. And so, if what is called the vibration of the density of the elements of the said medium has an affinity of vibration with the said active part of the omnipresent Okeadarnok, then, according to the world law called symmetrical entering, this active part blends with the presence of the said medium and becomes an inseparable part of it. And from that moment the given parts of the omnipresent Okeadarnok begin, together with the said elements of the said medium, to represent the corresponding densities required in planets, that is to say, various kinds of metalloids or even metals, as for instance, the metal I have placed in this sphere, and in which there will proceed artificially at this moment, at my wish, the action of striving to reblend into a whole of the parts of the Okeadarnok, and which metal, as I have already said, exists under the name of red copper. And further, having arisen in the planets in this way, the said various metalloids and metals then begin according to the common universal law called reciprocal feeding of everything existing, as it is generally proper to a rising of every kind in which Okeadarnok or any of its active parts participates, to radiate from their presences the results of their inner interchange of substances. And as is proper to radiations of every kind issuing from sur and intraplanetary formations that have acquired in their vibrations the property of Okeadarnok or of its active parts, and which are in what is called the centre of gravity of every said formation, the radiations of these metalloids and metals possess properties almost similar to the properties of Okeadarnok itself, or of one or another of its active parts. When the said masses of different densities that have thus arisen in planets under normal surrounding conditions radiate from their common presences the vibrations required for the said world law of reciprocal feeding of everything existing, then, among these vibrations of various properties, there is established, owing to the fundamental world law, Troi Med Kikaf, a reciprocally acting contact. And the result of this contact is the chief factor in the gradual change of the various densities in planets. My observations over many years have almost fully convinced me that it is owing only to the said contact and its results that there is actualized the stability of harmonious equilibrium of planets. This metal red copper, which I have placed in the sphere of my proposed artificial actualization of the action of the active parts of Okeadarnok, has at this moment what is called a specific density, reckoning from the unit of density of the sacred element Theomert Malagos of 444. That is to say, the atom of this metal was 444 times more dense and as much less vivifying than the atom of the sacred Theomert Malagos. Now see in what order its artificially accelerated transformations will proceed. Having said this, he first fixed before my organ of sight the automatically moving Tescuano, and then turned on and off various switches in a certain sequence, and as I looked through the Tescuano, he explained to me as follows. At this moment I admit the influx of all three parts of Okidarnok into the sphere containing this metal, and as all three parts have the same density, and hence the same force of striving, they reblend into a whole in this sphere without changing anything in the presence of the metal. And the omnipresent Okidarnok, thus obtained, flows in its usual state through a special connection out of the Harahara Hartsaha, and is reconcentrated in the first container which you have already seen. Now look, I deliberately increased the force of striving of only one of the active parts of the Okidarnok. For example, I increased the force called cathodinesis. In consequence of this, you see that the elements composing the presence of that red copper begin to evolve towards the quality of the substances that compose the ordinary presences of planets. As he explained this, he at the same time turned on and off various switches in a certain sequence. Although, my boy, I then looked very attentively at everything preceding, and everything I saw was impressed in my essence, pesto notiali, that is, forever yet nevertheless. Not even with my best wish could I now describe to you in words 100th part of what then proceeded in that small fragment of a definite intraplanetary formation. And I will not try to put into words for you what I then saw, because I have just thought of a possibility of soon actually showing it all to you, when you also can be an eyewitness of so strange and astonishing a cosmic process. But I will tell you meanwhile that there proceeded in that fragment of red copper something rather like those terrifying pictures which I occasionally observed among your favourites on the planet Earth through my Tescuanu from Mars. I said rather like, because what occasionally proceeded among your favourites had a visibility only possible of observation at its beginning, whereas in the fragment of red copper the visibility was continuous until the final completion of transformation. A rough parallel can be drawn between the occasional proceedings on your planet and the proceedings then in that small fragment of copper, if you imagine yourself high up and looking down upon a large public square, where thousands of your favourites, seized with the most intense form of their chief psychosis, are destroying each other's existence by all kinds of means invented by them themselves, and that in their places there immediately appear what are called their corpses, which, owing to the outrages done to them by the beings who are not yet destroyed, change colour very perceptibly, as a result of which the general visibility of the surface of the said large square is gradually changed. Then, my boy, this subsequent essence friend of mine, Gornahor, by means of switching on and off the influx of the three active parts of Okidarnok and changing their force of striving, also changed the density of the elements of the said metal, and thereby transformed the red copper into all the other also definite intraplanetary metals of lower or higher degree of vivifyingness. And here, for the elucidation of the strangeness of the psyche of the free-brain beings who have taken your fancy, it is very important and interesting to note that while Gunahor was, with the aid of his new invention, artificially and deliberately producing the evolution and involution of the density and vivifyingness of the elements of red copper, I noticed very clearly that this metal was transformed once upon the said plate into just that same definite metal, about which the sorry savants of your planet have been wise-acring during nearly the whole of their arising and existing, in the hope of transforming other metals into this metal, and thus constantly leading astray their already sufficiently erring brethren. This metal is called there gold. Gold is no other than the metal we call Pritzavalava, the specific weight of which, reckoning from the element of the sacred Theomerta is 1439. That is to say, its element is free and a fraction times less vivifying than the element of the metal red copper. Why I suddenly decided not to try to explain to you in detail in words all that then took place in the fragment of the said red copper, in view of my suggestion of the possibility of soon actually showing you in definite intraplanetary formations the process of various combinations of the manifestations of the active parts of Okidanok was because I suddenly remembered the all-gracious promise given me by our all-quarters maintainer, the most great arch-cherub, Peshtuvigna. This all-gracious promise was given me as soon as I returned from exile, and had to present myself first of all to his all-quarters maintainer, the arch-cherub, Peshtuvigna, and prostrated myself to produce before him what is called the essence sacred Alia Mazor Nakalu. This I had to do on account of the same sins of my youth, and I was obliged to do so because when I was pardoned by his uni-being endlessness and allowed to return to my native land, certain sacred individuals decided to demand of me, for any eventuality, to have performed over my essence this sacred process, in order that I might not manifest myself as in the days of my youth, and that the same might not thereby occur again in the reason of most individuals dwelling here at the centre of the great universe. You probably do not know yet what the sacred Alia Mazakona Kulu over an essence means. I shall later explain it to you in detail, but meanwhile I shall simply use the words of our dear Mullah Nasir ad-Din, who explains this process as giving one's word of honour not to poke one's nose into the affairs of the authorities. In short, when I presented myself to his all-quarters maintainer, he deigned to ask me, among other things, whether I had taken with me all the being productions which had interested me and which I had collected from various planets of that solar system where I existed during my exile. I replied that I had taken almost everything except those cumbersome apparatuses which my friend Gurnahor Harhak had constructed for me on the planet Mars. He at once promised to give orders that everything I should indicate should be taken at the first opportunity on the next trip of the spaceship Omnipresent. That is why, my boy, I hope that everything necessary will be brought to our planet Karatus, so that, when we return there, you will be able to see it all with your own eyes, and I shall be able to explain everything in detail practically. And meanwhile, during our travelling here on the spaceship Karnak, I shall, as I've already promised you, tell you in their order about my descents there to your planet, and also about the causes of what is called my appearances there in person.